Greetings, welcome to the Citizen exclusive video host Mpoki Thompson. I'm in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire for the Africa CEO Forum 2025. Today we're going to have a conversation with UK's Trade Commissioner for Africa, Mr. John Humphrey. Africa is seen as the center of development, so he's going to share with us what are some of those critical areas where the UK and other development partners are saying are most critical for developing the continent, developing East Africa, developing Tanzania. Humphrey, welcome to the Citizen Exclusive.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, this is the Africa CEO Forum. So the focus is how do we take Africa to the next level in light of the current global complexities that are going on. Africa is seen as a continent that is at the center of development. As international partners, as financial institutions are deprioritizing their support to Africa, what is still seen as the promise for Africa? Why is Africa still viewed as the continent of next development? Can you just share with us, your development partner, your trade partner, what are some of those areas?
Yeah, so my remit is not development focused per se. My remit is very much focused on commercial trade and development.
Yes.
Trade and investment.
Yes.
And the thing that's interesting about that is it's sustainable. And that really is the way that we're going to lift people out of poverty, create value, and create mutual relationships. So I think it's really interesting, and it's obviously a challenging moment at the moment for everybody. I think fiscally, I mean, governments in Africa are challenged, governments in Europe are challenged, and we're seeing obviously significant reductions in overseas development aid. But I think if that drives a shift to commercial trade and investment that is sustainable into the future and is mutual, then actually I think, that's something that we all need to focus on. So it feels to me like trade and investment in that sort of more commercial sense is really coming to the fore. And if you think about Africa then from that context, by 2050, it's going to be 25% of the world's working age population.
Indeed.
It's 60% of the world's unused arable land. It's all of those resources, all of those marine resources, all of that. So solar potential, renewable energy potential. So I think it's very hard, isn't it, to imagine that Africa is not going to be an important part of the global economy at some point in the future. And if you look at the British businesses that are here and have been here for a long time, it's because they have that perspective into the future.
But then the rhetoric that Africa is the next center for development has been ongoing, has been in existence for quite some time. When do we actually start to realize that potential? When do we feel it? When do we see the impact of that?
So I think that's really a question for Africa, I think, in many ways. And I think there are structural problems in Africa that I think Africa is really now trying to address. So, for example, doing trade within Africa is actually incredibly difficult, and Africa has a much lower level of intra-regional trade than other areas. And there's quite a lot of evidence to show that intra-regional trade is value-added trade. You build values, supply chains, and you sometimes get the situation in Africa where something that's made in Africa and is available in Africa, but somebody's importing it from somewhere else because it's easier to do. And that's why I think developments like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement are so exciting, because they potentially really change the game in terms of the trade potential within Africa, and that will make the market much more exciting for external investors. So I think, that's you're right, that narrative has been around for a long time. But I think, we're here in Cote d'Ivoire, and it's very clear this is an economy that now is growing on a regular basis quite strongly. You look around you at the infrastructure development that's going on, you can feel there's an energy there. So I think, there are 54 countries in Africa, and every market is different. So we don't always want to talk in generalities.
Exactly.
But I do think, there are certainly markets within Africa that are starting to take
So you've talked about the population dividend, that Africa is going to have the largest working force in the coming years. But then again, how do we tie the population dividend and also unlocking the commercial trade and making it a bit more impactful? Because at the moment, we are a commodity exporting market, as an emerging market.
No.
When we talk to about commercial trade and then looking ahead, the population dividend, what do you think will be the key decisions that will have to be made in order to tap into this?
So I I think you're absolutely right. And we always talk about a population or a demographic dividend, but in fact, it could be a demographic burden. If your economy is not growing fast enough to absorb all the young
Exactly.
people coming into the marketplace, then it becomes a problem. So I think the key to that is more value addition in the continent. So greater intra-regional trade, more value addition and more value going out in exports of other things rather than just exporting commodities. Which as we've seen, that has, people talk about the resource curse. Actually, sometimes it can be perceived to hold back development. So I think the UK is doing a lot to support that. So we have a mutual prosperity partnership with Tanzania that was signed in 2024. And part of that is to target investments, to look at things that are sustainable. So looking at creating jobs and value addition in Tanzania, as opposed to exporting something and then processing it in the UK. And there are quite a number of UK companies, for example, in East Africa that are doing, so if you look in the horticulture area in Kenya, for example, they're not just exporting the sort of raw, the flowers, if you like, or the vegetables. They're actually doing processing and creating jobs and everything else in a Kenyan context. And the UK is doing its part to try to support that. So we have something called the Developing Countries Trading Scheme. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that actually provides tariff-free, quota-free access for African exporters, not for every country, but for many countries within Africa. But what's really interesting about that scheme is it has some specific rules around what are called the rules of origin.
Yes.
And they allow value chains to be created in Africa, within Africa. So we see it as very much complementary to, for example, or supporting the aims of the AFCFTA, which of course the UK is also, very supportive of.
Now, in terms of value addition, when do we see value addition being extended beyond agriculture-related products? Because at the moment, that is much what we were focused on. I understand that agriculture is the backbone of many African countries' economy, but when it comes to trade, when do we see value addition beyond agriculture?
Well, I mean, I think these come to some of the structural issues in Africa. So, you need, if you want to industrialize, you need energy. You need a workforce that's educated and can do modern jobs. You need those transport infrastructure to enable you to move goods. So I do think there's a lot of structural issues that need to be addressed, and countries see that. You see that in their economic development plans. They recognise that they have to create the environment that supports business. Whether that's, as I say, investing in ports, investing in rail connections, investing in that connectivity that allow goods to move, but also perhaps creating things like economic zones that make it sort of attractive for somebody to bring something in from somewhere else, add value to it, and then export it. And we're seeing some success. You see, I mean, it was interesting. I was in Egypt not that long ago, and most of the London buses are made in Egypt. And they're made there because they've created the conditions which allow that manufacturing to take place and then to export back into the UK. So I think the UK is doing a lot to try to support that. And we are still the third largest investor in Africa in terms of investment stock. And a very large investor, of course, in Tanzania.
Yes.
And our trade with Tanzania has been growing. So, I mean, last year was about 452 million of trade, which was up about 30%. Still relatively small numbers, but growing quite strongly. And one of the things that I'm most pleased about is the UK's trade with Africa is pretty much 50-50. And it's really moved away from that sort of traditional commodity-based trade. The nature of our trade has changed.
It's changing. Yeah. Now, let's talk particularly about Tanzania and the potential that it has as a trade corridor. The government is very intentional in unlocking its potential in becoming the trade hub of the region through the Central Corridor, connecting the Port of Dar es Salaam to other landlocked countries. However, we're still seeing that potential not being fully realized. So what do you think remains the missing link in actually tapping into that?
So I mean, I think you're absolutely right. They are very intentional in doing that, and I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. If you think about the location of Tanzania and you think about ports like Dar, there's a strategic location, and of course it's part of the East Africa community as well. So I think that obviously facilitates some of that as well. So I think the barriers are always going to be, aren't they? They're going to be funding and capacity and all of those sorts of things. So, that's why, and you're talking about big investments. You're not talking about small scale investments. If you're expanding a port or you're building a rail link, those are big projects.
They are. They are. Now, the theme today is unlocking the potential between governments and the private sector. So that brings in the issue of the public-private partnerships. Here in Africa, it has been a conversation. African governments are looking to elevate their partnership, their collaboration with the private sector.
Yeah.
What do you think should be now the focus? How can the private sector come to the table, sit down with the public sector, and then drive the economic partnership forward? What will be critical in this agenda?
Maybe I have a view. Maybe my view is not necessarily shared by everybody, but
Yeah.
my experience is if you create the conditions, the investment will come. And so if you want to do public-private partnerships, you first thing, you need the legislation that supports that. So governments need to do work to put those regulations in place and everything else. And this was a journey that the UK's been on. We started doing public finance initiatives and projects over the long term. So we've learnt the lessons, got burned, had the problems, but also developed a way of doing it. And I think that that's exactly the thing. I think when you think in an African context, it'll be the mobilization of private capital that really makes the difference. And there, I think that's where relationships between governments to try and put those structures in place to make the business environment. And I think if you do that, that investment will come.
Okay, now, well, as a development partner, I want your candid response to how optimistic or pessimistic, if you will, are you regarding Africa truly becoming self-reliant economically and in all spheres? How optimistic are you that this is going to become a reality in the near future and not us having these conversations 10, 20 years from now?
So I think I'm cautiously optimistic. And I say that because I think there is a growing realization that actually you need to create the conditions for private enterprise, for private capital. But I think it's still very difficult in an African context. You talked about the low levels of intra-regional trade.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of challenges. It's not easy to move goods and things, around Africa. And that's where I think initiatives like the AFCFTA are so important. And I think, UK is very much committed to continue to support that. And we see that as a very positive development. And the UK is still very much, it's an economy. We're we're not a small economy, we're a big economy, but we're a small island state, really, in that sense. So, we succeeded by being open. And I think, that's what we need to do. I think we don't want to see everybody sort of closing up. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think there are real challenges. We shouldn't underestimate the challenges.
Well, Humphrey, we'll end on that note. It's been nice having a conversation with you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you were with me, Mpoke Thompson, for the Citizen Exclusive. We had an interesting conversation with the UK's Trade Commissioner for Africa, Mr.